Wonderful. Welcome everybody to our community conversation series. It's great to see faces and names on the screen. I'm Seema Patel. I'm with Collective Mind, Senior Advisor. We're probably going to have a couple more people roll in. So if you hear some, gaps in my conversation, I'm just admitting some folks, but I'm just going to share my screen and we can go ahead and get started. It's great to see everybody here. Great. So hopefully everybody can see my slides. Okay. Great. Okay. So welcome everybody. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction on Collective Minds. I'll run through that fairly quickly so we can get to the meat of the conversation today. But for those who are new to our events, Collective Mind essentially works with networks and those who work for and with networks to help them be more effective and impactful in what they do and what you all do. One side of that is consulting. So we provide advisory services, tools and frameworks, capacity building, team coaching, etc., to networks. The other side of what we do is supporting the folks and the groups who work for and with networks by offering professional development opportunities for those who want to improve their network practice, or through open learning sessions like this. This is just one of our open learning sessions. We also do monthly Networks 101 and Network Management 101 sessions. But these community conversations are a bit unique in that we invite practitioners to co-host these sessions with us. So we provide the space and the facilitation, but it's really about hearing from your network peers about the topics that you care about. And it's less about a traditional presentation and Q&A, though the logistics of that are certainly part of this. And it's more about having our co-host share a part of their network development journey and their experience and their learnings with you, the audience, and then using that to spur a conversation amongst your network peers so that it's both an opportunity for you to take away some practical learnings, but also hear the insights and experiences of other network practitioners. With that, I wanted to keep that really short. And with that in mind, it'd be great to get to know who's in the virtual room. So I would love it if you could just chat your name, network, location, in either one word or one sentence about what comes to mind for you when you think about equity. And it can be a word, a phrase, or a sentence about what equity means to you personally or what it means within the context of your network, just whatever comes to mind for you. But let's get an idea of who's here with us today. And that can also help our co-host sort of frame her conversation as well. So while that's happening, I'm just gonna let everybody know what to expect for today. So the format for these is that we'll have our co-host give the presentation and share some of those learnings. And then what we'll do is break out after that into small groups for just 5 minutes, just a bit of a warm up, get to know each other, but more importantly, reflect on how you feel in regards to the presentation, what comes up for you. We'll bring everybody back and then we'll have an open conversation. And that's what the majority of the conversation will be, the majority of the time slot will be. So with that, I want to introduce our host. So we have joining with us Ericka Stallings. She's the Executive Director of the Leadership Learning Community. And she's joining us today to talk about leadership learning communities' efforts to make equity a central component of every aspect of the network experience. So I'm really excited about today's conversation, really grateful to have Ericka here with us. I can see it, my audio might be a little wonky, so I'm gonna stop talking and pull up Ericka's slides. So welcome, Ericka, thanks so much.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for the warm welcome, appreciate it. I just wanted to share a little bit about LLC. You'll see our slide in a minute, so I'll give you sort of like elevator speech. I think of LLC as a network of people who care about leadership and leadership development. And we try to support folks to think about leadership in different ways. So shifting from the lone hero model of leadership to a more collective and collaborative approach. And so LLC endeavors to advance a model of leadership and leadership development that is equity centered, collective, and networked. And so the network component of the work is core to what we do. And we very recently became the home for Network Weaver. So the network component is even more embedded in the work that we do. I'm coming to this conversation with the assumption that you already know tons and tons about networks. And so I think, as Seema's already said, we're not coming as sort of like the content experts, but really just folks who are sharing our experiences with system shifting networks, which is the kind of network that I'm going to be talking from that. I'm going to be talking from that perspective. And so I'm going to be sharing some challenges that we've experienced as well as a success that we've experienced. And then just going to quickly go through a bunch of the things that we've learned over the course of working with networks, trying to center equity. So if you could go to maybe slide 4. Great. And so we have a definition of equity that we borrowed from Equity in the Center. And this isn't our official, we don't have an official definition of equity, but this is one that I found to be helpful. And I'll put a link to Equity in the Center in the chat if you want to learn a little bit more about them and the work that they do. And I'm gonna start moving to a description of our work so that we have a lot of time for conversation and the small groups and large group conversation. Seema, feel free to jump in if there's anything else that you want me to cover. So pulling back the curtain on this conversation. So I'm going to be sharing a success and a challenge from one network that we've been supporting, that LLC has been supporting. We've tried to, not only are we supporting a network, but we've used a network approach to the network weaving and support process. So both a group of staff and a network of consultants are working on this project. And it's we're supporting the development of a large health equity network. And right now there are about 600 folks in the network, and it's going to just grow incrementally over time. And so one success that I'll share with you is about centering equity, is that we were able to very effectively distribute equity funds. These are funds that could be used to cover childcare. People could use it for meal delivery, tech support, anything they needed to lower barriers to engagement. And what was important about these resources is not only are they generally useful and helpful in a network setting, but they also happened during 2020, during the midst of the pandemic. So for people who had even greater barriers to entry, these equity funds were really important for lowering those barriers. A consequence of the use of these funds is that we had really diverse participation in the network. The network was far more accessible to people from marginalized communities. And that meant that the core of the high level participating folks, the folks who you might think of as network activators, the people who are really pushing and driving the network, are very diverse, and they really reflect more the directly impacted people that we're trying to support through this network. So that's the fun part. Now going to the challenges. So, we are people who are committed to equity in our bones, and still the centering equity was challenging. One challenge that we had was about communication. That was and remains a challenge, given that this is a large group of people who are busy and who are being communicated at by lots and lots of people. in their personal lives and their private lives, and it's like in just the advertising. There are lots of people and things and entities that are competing for folks' attention, and so communicating within the network was a little challenging. The way we approached the communication was with the value of transparency. Unfortunately, what we kind of did was we flooded people with data and information, and in that process, what we missed is that we weren't flooding people with understanding. So we were broadcasting a lot, but we weren't necessarily communicating to the same level that we were broadcasting. And so a lesson for us was distinguishing between information and and downloading and actual transparency and understanding. And so the consequence of that is that our communication wasn't seen as transparent. And so there was some damage to trust that happened as a consequence. And we know that trust is core to building an equity-centered network. And so we had to respond by saying, hey, this happened, and we are endeavoring to fix it. And this is what we're doing. And so we developed a new website and new communications tools and a new communications committee and engaged more people in the process. And then we also began an equity assessment that we're currently in the midst of. And that's also going to help us to devise different communications methods and models. So that's one success and one concrete challenge from this particular network. I'm sorry, I should have told you about the slides. So slide 6 was the success and slide 7 was the challenge. And if we go to slide 8, we can talk about our learnings. And so these aren't in any necessarily particular order. These are just kind of as they come to mind for me. In terms of like what has been helpful over the years for us in centering equity and operationalizing equity and making equity real. And I think the concept of that we're talking about when we're talking about operationalizing equity is thinking about how do we move equity from like a concept and a theory and a value to an action? How are we embodying and living? I see a question in the chat. Sure, I'll talk about that, the communication tools, and some of it is, before I go into the learnings, I'll talk about that. They were small shifts, so we have a regular bulletin, and we just are thinking differently about subject lines and the content in the bulletin. We added more people to the communications team who are from the network. And finally, we got a website online so that rather than the information being broadcast at people, it had a communication home so that people could go and find what they were looking for in one place. And we're working on additional communications tools to make it easier for there to be more bi-directional communication. So that's the thing that's in the works. Sure. So going to our learnings, the first one is centering trust and relationships. And I should say for all of these learnings that it made it easier to operationalize equity. It didn't make it easy. It facilitated the process, but it didn't mean that there was no discomfort. And so I would say that like the overarching premise is that inequity undergirds pretty much all of the systems and structures that we live in, and deconstructing these systems is uncomfortable. And that part of the work, and you'll see like we're talking about, I'll get into that more in terms of the learnings, but sitting with that discomfort, dealing with the mess of we are deconstructing an old system and reconstructing something else. And we're living in a construction zone with all of the messy, dusty, uncomfortableness that entails. And I think if you don't have any discomfort, then you probably aren't doing some of the hard work that you need to do. And all of us, the network weaving folks, the consulting team staff, and the folks in the network are learning and relearning and unpacking and deconstructing and ripping apart lots of things and questioning tons of assumptions. And so none of us are completely on the most steady of ground because we are questioning so many different things that we might have thought of as, it is what it is. So many of the things that you say, just it is what it is. We question if that is actually true, and that brings up lots of feelings for lots of folks. And so in the beginning, when we say, well, oh, we're operationalizing equity and we're talking about it, it feels wonderful. It's a new space. It's an opportunity that folks may have not had in the past in other systems. And then actually doing the work of operationalizing equity is where that sense of discomfort comes in. And you have to be able to sit in it and hold it and not pass over it so that you can get back to the easy, fun feelings. Part of what I think makes it possible to actually sit in that discomfort is to have real relationships with folks. And so to actually invest in building relationships, it doesn't necessarily mean that you individually have to have, as a network weaver or a staff person or a consultant, has to have an individual relationship with everyone and every individual. But that you're creating places for people within the network to build relationships. This process is messy, it's disruptive, it's scary, it's challenging. Some of what the well-intentioned stuff that we tried failed. And so, we say in network spaces that we learn by doing, that, there's experimentation and we're innovating and we acknowledge that there's failure. But then when it fails, we're like, oh, why'd that fail? That sucks. And it doesn't feel great. But we push through it. And so we really spend a lot of time on deep listening. We had formal and informal listening sessions and surveys and things like that. We tried to create different kinds of spaces for people to connect, different kinds of affinity groups. We tried trust-based models. So in cases where we had stipends, we had upfront stipends rather than reimbursements, and we tried to limit the kind of paperwork and things that people had to prove how they use funds. And we tried to be as transparent as possible. And as I mentioned with the communication challenges, that worked and didn't work in some cases. Another learning was the importance of centering and naming equity as a network value and goal. Establishing a culture that centers equity, saying it out loud that equity is central, looking at the results and the outcomes. And so asking yourselves, asking ourselves, were the outcomes that we got in alignment with the values that we'd articulated? We also had to invest in equity. And so that in terms of staffing, the equity funds, the compensation, innovation funds, training and tools, those sorts of things. And we had conversations even among the staffing, the consultant groups. We were very transparent about how people were paid. And then if folks saw that there was something inequitable in that, we could have a conversation about that and respond. Another learning is that we had to be willing to change, to really be focused on disrupting inequitable systems and behaviors, and to lift that up. We had to actively and literally center marginalized people. And so not just say we center marginalized people in our conversation and in saying it, but we had to actually think about how do we actually do it? What do people see? Who's represented in the network? Looking at participation trends, reaching out to folks. And one thing that we observed is that, particularly in marginalized groups, that when people were invited in, they were more likely to participate than when we simply said everybody's welcome. Telling people you can be here, that you have what you need to be here, and that we believe and trust that, resulted in increased participation. Another component was to be conscious of power, of power relations, where they exist, they're formal, informal, and intentionally redistributing power. Seema, am I going too slowly? Good to go? Cool. Another was being okay with messiness and being open to conflict. Um, like, everyone wants things to change as long as they stay the same, in the ways in which we're comfortable and how we know how it works. And so if we want to have change, then it's going to be messy. There's going to be conflict. Some of what we tried didn't work, and we had to, do different things. We had to learn to be flexible and responsive. We had to learn to be iterative. If something that we were trying didn't work, we had to try something else. We intentionally incorporated learning is in the name of our organization. So learning was part of what we were doing. So creating communities of practice, and knowing that this was going to be ongoing and constant. And when I say this, we knew intellectually that this was the case. That didn't mean that like in our guts and in our hearts that it wasn't hard. And so there were, hurt feelings when you tried something and it didn't work, or it was critiqued. Um, um, we had to, moving on to 7 is what we also learned to be mindful of like disparate impact. That sometimes when we say experiment or try something, the cost of failure isn't the same for everyone. And so understanding that the risk assessment that folks make will be different depending on where they sit, um, uh, in wherever you are, and whatever the system of and structure where you are. Um, One thing that we learned the hard way, and we had to keep learning, is the importance of having shared language. So like, what are our collective values? What do we actually mean when we say equity? What do we mean when we talk about power or privilege, or what does racism mean? And what does it mean to see this in action? And realizing that while this takes time, the change takes time. That doesn't mean that you have to that action takes time. And what I mean by that is that when we say be patient and to take time, meaning that we're not going to undo centuries of inequity in a few months, but that doesn't mean that we sit and we don't work. And so we need to be in action, but the result of that action takes time. Um, and then moving on to 9, it was important for us to value curiosity. And so we had to take time and space for reflection and assessment. And so asking lots of questions, um, interrogating our own assumptions, but more importantly, being okay with other people interrogating our assumptions, being able to ask, is this actually working? Like, not just, I'm used to doing it this way, or everyone does it this way. This is how it's done, but is this actually working for us? What we're observing in the moment. Um, Being willing to move on from some things that you might be attached to when the outcomes don't align with practices. And that's something that, happened with us, where people, have ways, we've been accustomed to working in a certain way, or to doing things. And sometimes in a different context, we had really good results. And then in a different context, maybe not. And so being able to ask, is this actually working? One thing that we, were inconsistent about and regretted later was about collecting data. And so it doesn't always have to be like quantitative, but always, collecting data and collecting information is something that, we definitely would, be helpful to like think about how things are being distributed, and understanding, having a better picture. Related to that, also about curiosity, is supporting experimentation and innovation, which is like, pretty standard network value. It's not really reinventing the wheel, but sometimes, depending on, how the network is structured, or maybe even how it's funded. So if you have an external funding source that's that wants outcomes, that maybe experimentation and innovation goes by the wayside. So in our case, we put a lot of attention to supporting experimentation, trying on, and learning from that. And then the last one that I'll add is what we really benefited from was having folks in the Network Weaver pool of folks who were trauma informed facilitators, because we come to this place and we say, oh, we want to disrupt all these things, we want to be equitable, and like you're holding centuries of intergenerational trauma that you just like, where do you think it goes? Like it has to go somewhere. And we want to talk about these, we're unpacking and we're digging up things that are very, very painful. And we're asking people to revisit like significant trauma. And so we needed people in our network and our team who could hold that. So that we weren't re-traumatizing people all over the place. We come to network as people, and all of our trauma comes with us. And so being able to understand the impact that of trauma, helped us to navigate, disappointment and challenges. And it didn't mean that people didn't feel it, but we were able to hold it. And it took time, and along with being messy. And so like even having trauma informed consultants and people who could hold, didn't mean that like that everything worked perfectly always, but it was important for us to focus on that and to have that be centered in the work. There's a question about leadership within the network and how it ties to equity. Yeah, so we've been working with.
I just want to, I think rather than break out, we should just go ahead and launch into the conversation. So it's great that Sabira has already kicked off that. Let's go ahead and have you answer Sabira's question, but let's also just start the conversation. It'd be great to hear about what came up for people as they were listening to Ericka's talk. What experiences have you yourself had in either successfully or unsuccessfully trying to integrate or center equity within your own networks? So let's go ahead and launch into that. But yeah, feel free to go ahead, Ericka. Thanks.
Sure. So in this network, we worked with Circle Forward to support us in the design of the governance process. And so we had teams of folks who design teams of folks from the network who would think about how do we make decisions. And so they have what we call a governance design team that thought about like how do we want to make decisions and how do we want to distribute power in this network. And it was an iterative process. So we had a process, the beginning of the network, we sort of thought about, I think of the network as operating in 3 stages. The first stage is, what do we want this to be? The second stage was trying on and experimenting and then refining how the network could function. And then the third and final stage is implementation and ongoing reflection and refinement. And so there was an initial stage of thinking about like, how do we want this to function? There was a design team in stage 2 that thought about, okay, let's try some things on. And then based on the learning from part 2, in part 3, the governance design team started to think about and essentially created a charter for how decisions would be made and power distributed in the network. And so the process includes a transition from LLC holding lots of operational support for the network to the network moving to a fully autonomous governance structure. Hope that answers your question. Oh, and you asked about equity. because equity was a core value of the network, it was central to all of the decision-making processes. And so the whole governance and decision-making process kind of had an equity screen. And so we said, is this process equitable? Who's included, who's excluded in the process? And a core component of that was transparency and making sure that the network knew what was going on. And still, people, who are getting lots of information are like, what's happening in this network? So it's an ongoing process. It's not like a perfect, like, oh, we did it like this, and then we had a broadcast and then a website, and then it was all perfect. There's always sort of like movement where we have to drill down more and more and more. I'll turn it back to you, Seema.
Great, thanks. Yeah. However folks feel comfortable engaging in the conversation, either through typing in a question or a comment in the chat or just unmuting yourself, you can feel free to do either. But interested to hear about other experiences as well from there's, as you've come to this conversation to learn about equity, how have you been framing it within your own networks, or what experiences that you all have had in trying to define equity within your network. So I think there's a whole range of topics. I'm very interested to hear about people's reflections and experiences.
Hi, I have a question for Ericka. My name's Christy Gabbard. Thanks for answering my question earlier, Ericka. We've done some work with a network centering equity and did some of the things that you mentioned around, actually we worked with Circle Forward. They were great in incorporating consent-based decision-making in our network. We use sort of some shared leadership models with co-chairs and even had tri-chairs. One of the big challenges, really very messy and so eye-opening and also hard at times, and a lot of very internal work that shifted our focus from sort of the external network development. Not that it wasn't important, it was entirely important that we had this internal focus, but just the reality was it did shift from what we were doing for our larger network, because the equity work was really with our leadership group. And one of the challenges that we had, and I'm wondering how maybe if you've experienced something similar, and if you did, how you've dealt with it, is that a lot of the burden, I think, was carried by the Black and brown people to sort of deal with white people realizing just across the board, just realizing the impacts of individual decisions and institutional frameworks. And so all of this work created an extreme burden on the Black and brown leaders that were part of our leadership group. And it's such a slow, messy process, as you said, that I think over time it became really too much. And I'm wondering if you guys, if you experience something similar, or any sort of reflection you have on that would be helpful.
Yeah, so we had some things, the realities of like inequity and racism in this country fall on Black and like brown and like BIPOC bodies, period. So that you see it also in our networks. And so, that happened in our network, particularly after George Floyd, where even among the consulting pool, people are like, I've had enough. And we're not doing anymore anything extra. And I think because equity was central and woven throughout the network, not just in in one part of it. It wasn't like put it away in the corner. And there wasn't like an equity team that dealt with equity, and then other people didn't have to think about it. It was when it's woven throughout, other people could step in. And so white folks stepped up to take more of the burden. And even that was, kind of challenging, because some some like Black and brown people like, whoa, why are you taking up this kind of space? And so there's no space where there's no conversation. There's no space where that things aren't contested. The experiences of like Black and brown people aren't monolithic. So I can't speak for all Black women and what space they want me or what space they want to take up in the network. And so all of these happen, it's always negotiated over and over and over again. But I think embedding equity throughout the network, and not just in like an equity committee or just in the corner, made it easier for other people to step in and take up space. So that was our experience. And so sorry, it wasn't like, here's the easy answer.
Oh, I don't think there's any easy answers, but yeah, I really appreciate hearing your experience. Thank you very much.
I have a question for Ericka as well. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I just have to say your voice is super calming and relaxing, and I love it. But yeah, my question is, you had mentioned about trauma-informed network weavers and, literally centering marginalized people. So in the transition from developing like the forming and storming stage to implementation to an autonomous network, were there members that stepped up into more like leadership roles that were paid as
Yes.
other consultant and staff moved out of those roles?
Yeah, and so we're still in between the implementation experience. We're just starting the transition to the fully autonomous. So there's still a team in there. But what we did was we had network activators, and who were out there, engaging folks in the network and doing work and starting projects. And then we also have leads. And so there are some folks who are paid, and then the plan is for them to, LLC to get out of the way, and for them to have a project manager and a project lead who are paid positions to do this work. And so, the role of money makes things difficult because it can be sort of like a negative incentive. And so we wanted to make sure that that money is treated as something that's facilitative, but it's not the purpose. And so, that can get challenging. And also for me, there's some ways in which, when the combining equity with money makes me a little uncomfortable. Because I think people, particularly when we say, if we want to get people of color, we need to like add money. And like, I definitely want to get people of color paid. And I don't want to accept the assumption that people of color don't do stuff that they care about unless they are paid. And so, divorcing those two things is I think important. But yes, I think resourcing and making it materially possible for people to engage in the work is important. The reality is like economic inequality in this country happens, and so some people are going to make it be easier for some people to engage than others, and it's more likely that Black and brown people are going to have a more difficult time because of material barriers. And so if we address those material barriers, we'll have more engagement. But like distinguishing between material barriers and desire, incentive, and purpose, and like why people come to this is also an important thing, just for me personally.
Ericka, oh, sorry. Did I just step on someone's toes?
Go ahead, Rachel. I'll go after you.
Oh, thanks, Ashley. Thank you so much, Ericka. This has been really generative. I would love to hear more about the trauma-informed practices of your network weavers. When you said that, that resonated really deeply. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that looked like.
I mean, I'm not like a trauma-informed specialist, so like I can't like tell you like this is how they do it. I just can tell you that there are folks who know how to hold folks, what they see, observe the trauma, interrupt, and hold folks. And sometimes it happens in the moment in the group. And also some of the ways in which they structure, like I'm thinking particularly about some of the consultants, and like they structure conversations that invite in the spirit. They'll use embodied methods, or somatic practices. And so they create containers designed to hold trauma, in addition to being responsive to trauma, like if it bubbles up. So that's what I can think of in terms of like, how to describe what we've benefited from having those folks in the space.
That's great. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Ericka. I just wanted to offer something that stood out to me in terms of your list. Well, really everything, but the idea of shared language and understanding, and just a reflection from my perspective. I support a network of organizations that work in neighborhoods focused on sort of holistically housing, education, and community wellness, working in neighborhoods that are typically high poverty, majority Black and Brown communities. And we're working with an organization called the Frameworks Institute, who's helping us kind of position how we communicate about issues around poverty and race. And so they've been around for a long time. They're a really interesting organization. And they did a bunch of focus groups, just talking to general public, cross-cutting across race, gender, class, everything, and found that, certain, like, when we talk about equity, it just reminded us that we're kind of in our bubble. And to most people, in terms of those focus groups, found that equity to people meant, shares of ownership in an asset and things like that. And that's just one example. And there's many terms, of course, as we talk about all these things. So that was just a reminder to us in terms of we're thinking about kind of how to frame things, how to get people to think about the impacts of systemic racism and, get away from the bootstraps mentality and jumping to that, all that. So it's not really a question, but it's kind of just as we're thinking about communicating both within our networks, I think, but then also kind of outwardly in terms of our work, that I have to kind of check myself in terms of assumptions of what people are literally, visualizing as they think about some of these terms and all that. And that's the tricky part about equity, is just it is hard to define because it can be so broad. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, sometimes it's we need shared language in part so that we can, make sure that we all have the same destination and same goal. And sometimes we don't have shared language because we don't want to talk about the hard and uncomfortable stuff. Like, we don't want to know that we don't actually think about equity in the same way. Yeah, I'm all about avoidance in like my personal life. So, why not in our networks?
Hey, Ericka, this is Andrew. I'm down here in Arkansas, and I appreciate what you shared and just the intention behind your process that you did. And I have a question for our network. We're trying to design a network equity audit, which sounds wonky, but trying to see how we're doing and find our blind spots and involve network members in doing that. And I think that ties into what you talked about around reflection. And making space for that. So I'm just wondering if there were any tools or process that you use for reflection that would be helpful for others, to go through that.
I think for us, we similarly just kind of like embedded like learning and, what did we learn from this experience in having those kinds of conversations, but we're also actually in the midst of doing an equity assessment ourselves. And we're working with social insights research. We're starting with our survey, and then there's going to be a collective kind of like meaning and sense making after. So we're actually in the middle of that, so I can't share the learning yet, but maybe we'll come back and be able to share like what we learned from that experience, but from the survey experience, but embedding reflection in our conversations. And so after we did a network activation fund, and then we do teach backs and learnings from those experiences. So just, I think it was yesterday, we did like a share back on, okay, we tried this, what happened, how did that work? And it happened in kind of informal, scheduled share backs, but then also less formal, like embedded in our regular week meetings. And then as part of like iterative processes, we're like, how did that feel? How did that work? And asking those questions just kind of all the time.
Not to put you on the spot or anything, Andrew, I'm curious though, if you have anything more to share about what an equity audit within your network looks like, or how you guys came up with that framework.
Yeah, and the network is the Food Systems Leadership Network. This is a national network, and it's, loosely, there's around 2,000 members, so it's a big kind of loose network. And we're thinking about that based on, over the past year, we also developed tools for ourselves at the Wallace Center to review our programs and our communications, like checklists, so that we're making sure we're centering equity the way we say we want to, and everything. So it's kind of like a stop and look at things as we go through. And we know that's not the right tool for a network, but we haven't found another way to look at network structures and kind of make sure that we're centering equity in all of those. So really, in trying to become more member driven, want to have members come in, and we can share the tools we have. So we've got this, we think these could help review communications, but they're not specifically designed to a network. So how can we design it together? So it would be kind of like an action learning group where we come up with the tool together and then try it quickly and then see, learning and reflection afterwards to see how it went and share what works. So.
Yeah, Brian, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm participating in something called ULab, which it's based on Theory U, and the guy that wrote the book Theory U is Otto Scharmer from MIT. And I'm in kind of a coaching community, and had a conversation this morning about a 4D exercise. And Andrew, I'm kind of gearing this to you. The model that I saw on video had to do with intellectual disabilities for an individual in a family, and the people in that ecosystem who support that individual and that family, and the educational system and the government. And it was an exercise where people took a position, a physical sculpture of how they felt relative to the other energies in the group. And after the system informs everyone in the system, you come up with one word as a representation, as a representative for whatever entity you belong to. When the system heard every word from every different entity, they were encouraged to take a second posture in this human sculpture and then give another word. And then as a group, there would be this emerging conversation that, based on all that I've heard from all of these entities, I now know this that I did not know before. And it was a profound experience to witness. And I can try and find that video and send it to you if you wanted to learn more about it, if that makes any sense to anybody.
I think I'd have to see the video, but that sounds interesting to me. I've read some about Theory U and explored that, and I think it's a powerful framework. So yeah, if you can find it,
Okay.
I'd love to see it.
Can I chime in, Seema? I just remembered something about the learning that I forgot. And this is both a success and a challenge. We had a person who on our team was sort of like the learning person. And part of what they were doing is it was capturing learning, looking at how we were learning, and encouraging us to collect the learning and the stories and so that was a success. The not so success is that person had lots and lots of skills, and we kept pulling her away from the learning part to do other things, to do coaching here or this, that, the other there. And so I think in some ways in our we came back to it, but in some ways we undermined that a little bit by like pulling from that resource and not always applying it to the learning. But we've done things like case studies and things like that, so that we were capturing stories and surveys and stuff. But that was part of it. The other part about learning that that we are thinking about more, and that you'll be, if you follow Network Weaver, you'll hear about more, is thinking about how do we decolonize networks, because a lot of the learning that comes from networks is pulled from communities of color, indigenous communities, things like that. And it can be extracted, and we want to remember that there's actually still wisdom in those communities, and it's not so much that we need to go back to these communities and show them how to do networks. These communities have been doing networks for a long time, and so how do we have a different kind of conversation? So this conversation about decolonizing networks and network spaces is something that we'll be digging into some more, but we're still in the kind of early stages of thinking about it, but it's an observation that we had, and we thought we need to do something and say something about that.
Eric, I also want to just make sure that Janet's question came to the forefront. Can you talk a little bit about how you equip network members to interact with power systems in a grounded way, and how you address any aftermath so that it doesn't negatively impact network participation and progress?
So I would say, like, in this particular group, they are folks who come from very different places. And so the power structures that they might be confronting are different. So outside of like them doing individual trainings on how to on advocacy and organizing and shifting power, with a lot of the power conversations are about how power is distributed within the network. And so those are the conversations that we had, and that's because as the consultants and the staffing team, we had a lot of power and control over how power and control got distributed. So it was really, for us, it was about mostly getting out of the way and then letting folks practice redistributed or distributed power structures, which is part of LOC. We have a co-ED model, and distributing power is kind of part of that's our thing. So that was embedded in the process.
Ericka, this is Kirsten with Collective Mind, and I'm just so pleased. This is such a fantastic conversation, and I'm so grateful to you for having been here with us today. And the question I have is, that keeps coming up to me as you're speaking and as I'm listening to everyone else, is how do you know that you're on the right path? How do you know that you're going in the right direction, that you're making progress? What can tell you that? Who can tell you that? But sort of how do you know that you're, again, going in the right direction with all of this, assuming you have good intentions, right? So would love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I don't really have an answer. I think that's part of the reason why we've been doing this equity assessment. I mean, I think having clear values and goals at the outset that you can kind of compare to. So, if you look, and I mean, I think you look at your folks and you're like, what we have, we don't have any people of color in the leadership team, or like, we don't have any folks who are directly impacted in the leadership team, or, we actually don't have any folks who are low income in leadership, so looking at things and seeing where things are going. I think maybe like if things feel a little touch too comfortable, like, you probably, maybe you've missed some stuff. Looking and thinking about like, are we creating opportunities for disruption? And is there disruption happening? I mean, because like these are the systems that we're trying to disrupt and deconstruct some things. And so, is that happening? And I think that's part of like the learning and assessment process of like constantly questioning. And I think for us, we've had the experience of feeling like we were on the right track, and then, it being made clear to us that like, we've deviated in some way. And so I think having a group of folks who are willing to be in conversation with you and to challenge is going to be important.
I'd love to ask another question, but I also, in case somebody else who hasn't spoken would like to speak out, I'll take a step back.
Rachel, I just
Yeah.
posted that for the group and I'll shut up now. I just wanted to call attention to it, that 4D map exercise. Thank you.
Oh, cool. Thanks. And I'm mindful of our time, and this might be too big of a question for 3 minutes, but just thinking about being a learning organization and have learning as a central value, and also being a consulting group or being people who are trying to drum up business or have clients, and just thinking about, does it ever feel like there's a tension with the people who come to your organization who want you to do something for them? And this sort of almost like performance of like, we have the answers, we know how to do this, we're guiding the way. And so how to hold the sort of tension between sort of being the experts in the room and also really leading from a learning ethos.
Sorry, I've turned the camera off because my internet's unstable. And so I think for us, we setting the stage in the beginning of this as a learning process and articulating learning by doing, learning in action, and experimentation and trying on as core values of the work in the beginning. And it's when someone asked me a different conversation about managing expectations. And so I think you can tell people, listen, we're going to be doing it this way, like it's a network process, it's we're going to learn by doing and this kind of thing. And people say, yes, I get that. But in your gut, what we've been socialized to do is different from that. And so it's a constant conversation where we said, these are our values, and always going back to them, almost like ground rules or community agreements in a meeting where we're like, this is what we've agreed to, this is what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do this differently because we have these values of we're trying to deconstruct and disrupt inequitable systems. And we can't do that with old tools. And so we are building with these new tools together. And so I think that is having that kind of conversation and moving with people on a regular. And like I said before, like that doesn't mean that it won't be uncomfortable and there won't be hard conversations, and also that people won't believe you. Because people are like, I know how power works. And you might say that we're behaving in one way, but are you really? And so you're constantly having to be trusted by being trustworthy, and it takes time. And so, your feelings might get hurt because you will have tried and people may not believe you. And like, you have to over years investing in that approach.
Wow. I wish we could have a part 2. This has been such an awesome discussion. Thank you so much, Ericka. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm really quickly just going to pull up the closing slide because I know we're at time, but we have a range of offerings coming up and more community conversations like this, including opportunities if any of you want to host a topical conversation as well. But we've got some network leadership workshops coming up in May. Those are paid opportunities. And then, as I mentioned, Networks 101 and Network Management 101. And then some upcoming community conversations on network culture, and a special topic that Collective Mind will host on a donor research initiative that we are undertaking. So sign up for our newsletter, join us again. Such a pleasure to have you, Ericka, and just an awesome, really rich conversation. Great questions, everybody. So thank you for joining, and look forward to seeing everybody at another one of these conversations or sessions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.